Thank you, Uma. Our next discussant is Joe Glauber. Joe, I'm sure, is known to many in this audience. He is Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI, a long career with IFPRI, a distinguished scholar, and we're delighted to have him here. And he will focus, I think, our attention a little bit more on the international trade aspects of what's going on in the agriculture.
Great. Well, thanks very much. And it is a pleasure to follow Ashok and the other discussants. I think this is, I got a lot out of his brief comments. I am going to talk more about the trade aspects. My experience with India has largely been on the trade negotiation front and other things back when I was representing the U.S. in WTO negotiations. But I just wanted to talk a little about trade and start with a similar figure that Ashok showed in his presentation, and that is, one is, over the last 25 years, there really has been a remarkable transformation in the fact that India continues to be a very, very large exporter. You can see these numbers have come down a bit over the last few years, but that's largely due to market prices for grains and some of the products that India exports. And indeed, if we look at their share of global exports, Ashok mentioned rice, where they are the largest exporter. Also, over the last few years, have been the largest exporter of beef, which I think a lot of people don't realize. A lot of it's buffalo and other things that are moving to China and other markets. But again, very, very important. Cotton, too, has been very important export, although, as you can see, over the last few years, that has dropped largely because India is exporting a lot of fiber now to the rest of the world or primarily to China and other big markets, textile markets. But again, just to say, these markets, I don't have wheat here. Wheat, if you were to go back 5, 10 years ago, also very, very large on world markets. Briefly, but again, very important. If you look at tariff rates, and I think this is important, India has very, very large bound tariff rates. But as Ashok had mentioned, with some of the reforms that we've seen, India has brought those applied rates down considerably to their MFN partners, and so they import a lot. Again, this gives a lot of policy space. That is the difference between the applied rates and the bound rates. And I think that is a consideration when they're in trade negotiations. But the fact is, the bound rates are very, very high. They do snap back occasionally, and which they use for protectionist type reasons during import surges and other things. But largely, I think the remarkable thing is how low the applied rates are, and they are, while not one of the lowest in developing countries, they are much lower than certainly their bound rates would convey. We've gone over this a lot in terms of the overall producer support. I think everyone has shown this chart, but I think it is, again, something that we've known. India continues to tax its producers fairly heavily. That has declined a bit over the last a couple of years. And in particular, if you look at the support varying by commodity, you can see a lot of specialty crops like potatoes, mangoes, and bananas, other things having very, very high negative taxes for those producers, whereas we have seen some positive support for things like poultry, pulses, maize, and others. The pulse one is of interest if for no other reason than recently Canada and the U.S. brought a counter notification to India to the WTO saying that their support for pulses was exceeding the de minimis levels under the terms of the agreement on agriculture, and will potentially a source of friction. But I think that if one, I think an encouraging sign is, again, this move towards more income support and away from market price support, particularly market price support that actually ends up taxing producers. But if to the degree that this can be moved towards more decoupled forms. Another thing that is quite important is India has one of the world's largest, particularly in the developing world, insurance programs. And India has tried various schemes. The most recent schemes had initial success where at least you saw some participation rates moving up to about 30% or more of overall area production in the insurance program. That's dropped back in recent years, and that's not atypical for insurance programs generally. And like a lot of other insurance programs in the world, this is highly subsidized, I think almost to the tune of 95% premium subsidies. So again, a concern, but I think at the end of the day, at least insofar as trade is concerned, I'll hearken on a point that Uma raised, and that's infrastructure. I think I know it's a easy thing to say and a difficult thing to implement, but improvement of roads, improvement of rail, other things to move product from inland markets to consumer areas to export are the things that will improve prices the most, I think, for producers and really can help stimulate production and other things. But with that, I think I'm going to cede a minute and go to discussion.